Hello and welcome to the History of Ceramics. I'm Paul Greenhouse.
And I'm Stephanie Rosine. I'm excited about these next two episodes that we're diving into. The story of lives, the work of kind of the legendary collaboration and friendship between Lucie Rie and Hans Koper. These two kind of titans of studio ceramics, I would say, who didn't just shape modern ceramics. I think that they redefined it in a kind of major way.
They come at a moment in the history of modern ceramics that we can see them really as transformatory, and an awful lot of thinkers at the time and fellow ceramic artists see them as the great watershed. In some ways, they join us back to the grand earlier modernisms, and then they anticipate what came after the two of them. So why do you think we're dealing with the two of them together, given that they're both giants?
Right. Well, I think that theirs is maybe one of the most significant partnerships of the 20th century in studio pottery. Right. They were often collaborators. They had, I would say, a very dear and caring friendship over the years. So I think that it's important for us to kind of separate out their life stories, but also talk about the intertwinedness that they had through their lives and work. And I just wanted to start us off today because we're going to start with Lucie Rie. She's a bit older. We need to sort of set her up before Hans comes into her life. And she writes in 1951, "To make pots is an adventure to me. Every new work is a new beginning. Indeed, I shall never cease to be a pupil." So that's where I'd like to start today.
Absolutely. And it's quite appropriate because, in a way, she's the boss.
Yeah.
The elder figure and so forth. And an incredible intimate relationship, which we can look at and go into because their life stories, their life trajectories
so intertwined,
crossed over and quite intertwined.
So you've spent decades with their work, first sort of at the V&A and then at the Sainsbury Center. And, we were looking at some of these pots yesterday at the V&A and kind of pondering on the permanent installation of her studio that's there. I think one of the things that that work reminds me of is that her work is sort of a perfect, quiet study, right? It's there's a search for kind of stability. There's a rigor within the work. And I'm really excited to get into the story of her life, which is, begins in Vienna, her path, how she survived both world wars, and ultimately, she finds her voice in London. So she's an immigrant. She taught generations of potters sort of the meaning of elegance and restraint. And today we're going to travel with Lucie right up to sort of the pivotal moment when she meets this desperate young German refugee, Hans Koper, when he knocks on her door. So this is the story of Lucie Rie. I was first introduced to her work as a student and was, quite mesmerized by the delicate, refined forms that she was able to produce. They're always kind of awe-inspiring from that first moment of seeing them. And then even again yesterday, she was always presented to me as a British potter, but she is in fact Austrian, isn't she?
We're very good at making people British where they're clear winners. We're very good at that. Yeah, she's not British, she's Austrian. But she came to live and she made her life in London. But I would say that the Viennese background, absolutely vital. Mm-hmm. Had she been born in Britain, she wouldn't have been Lucie Rie. Right. Let's just get that really clear. Regardless of talent, she would have been different. Because she was born into this extraordinary moment in Viennese culture. I mean, my view, being a great fan of late 19th century art generally, it's a golden age right across the arts. The period gave us Art Nouveau, it gave us the arts and crafts, it gave us Impressionism, Post-Impressionism, it gave us many of the great pioneer movements. And Vienna gave us a very particular thing, a wealthy, big, powerful city at that time, we must remember, one of the main centers of European culture. And she grew up in the middle of it. She was Jewish and from a Jewish family. That's highly significant, and we'll come back to it. And she came from a very intense intellectual environment as well. So she benefited from what was going on in Viennese culture, we would say.
So let's talk a little bit about design culture in Vienna at this time, at the turn of the century.
Yeah.
What set it apart from other places across Europe?
The Viennese developed a very particular approach to modern design. If we see the grand wave across Europe in the late 19th century that we collectively call Art Nouveau, which is in a way the first pioneering modernism prior to the modern movements in the 20th century, the Viennese, and actually interestingly enough in Scotland the Glaswegians, were two cultures which developed a very different approach to Art Nouveau. Through much of Europe, it was very natural and curvilinear and organic and sensuous and sensual. In Vienna, it was far more geometric, it was far more restrained, far more controlled. It was still very sensuous, it very dense and rich, but the Viennese developed across all of the arts, a kind of informal geometry to their work that was going to anticipate modernism in the 20th century. So a key moment, and some of the most important designers in European history were there. And one of them taught Lucie Rie.
Right. And that kind of ethos is really it coalesces around the Wiener Werkstatt.
Absolutely, yeah. So late 19th century, they loved their movements. Lots of movements, lots of manifestos. The isms are everywhere. And in Vienna, the Wiener Werkstatt, the Viennese workshop in translation, but we call it Viennese, we don't change the translation. It's rather more romantic. Was a bit different from most others because it was a workshop. So in a sense, it wasn't a movement like purism or synchronism, so forth. It was a place where you could go and train. But it had a very powerful ethos committed to this approach to design, this geometrical, rarefied, purified approach to design that was everywhere. So her parents bought furniture there. Her parents went there and visited there. So she was exposed to it quite early on. And it would have, because of that, been in her home. Mm-hmm. So she was in the middle of this maelstrom of design activity, really pretty much from the start.
And there's a key principle that comes out of this, which I'm going to apologize ahead of time for my terrible German pronunciations, but Gesamtkunstwerk, this idea of total work of art. And this is presented in this shop of different furniture and houseware objects that you would really curate your entire space in this design aesthetic of this crisp geometry and functionalist modernism, we might say. But that design also is connected to the Vienna succession, is it not?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I would say, and have long very tediously said, that the idea of Gesamtkunstwerk is the single most important idea in European design over the last 150 years.
Why?
Because it was a generation of young designers and artists, all intermingled, who were committed to the idea that all of the arts had to be pulled together and orchestrated under the bigger umbrella of architecture. So, in a sense, it's making design into a kind of operatic thing. And that's quite appropriate because the term Gesamtkunstwerk, as far as we can see, was first used by Richard Wagner in relation to opera. And you can see it would work there, writing, singing, performing, art, the artist doing backdrops. So that notion that you create a total environment, a Gesamtkunstwerk, a total work of art. Now, that's amazing that this young woman would have had that idea milling around her. And I'm sure it affected the way that she saw the world.
Well, because everything's designed together, right? And when you're creating or you're living in a space where every element is sort of thoughtfully considered, I think that certainly would affect affect her. And I think it's important for her in her later life, which we're going to get to. But for right now, I thought we could perhaps jump into her upbringing and what kind of life she was born into, who her family was. And we know that she was born into this really intellectual environment that you're describing in 1902.
Yeah, you bet. Only to say, perhaps in relation to this Gestaltkunstwerk, because as we know, she became a potter.
Yeah.
And she stayed with that. And it always occurred to me when we look at the grand psychology within visual culture, there seem to me to be broadly two types of approaches which really formulate the modern idea of what design is, the modern idea of what craft is, and the modern idea of what art is. That is, some artists, some designers design in every medium. Her teachers, the great Vienna secessionists, they worked right across the medium and they didn't limit themselves. But there's always been a big thread throughout the history of art of artists who are obsessed with one medium. I'm looking at you, Stephanie, a little bit.
It's not a problem for me.
But those people who give their lives to a medium, like ceramic, like painting, like so on and so on. And she was exposed to this total work of art idea, and at the same time, probably early on, searching for something. What is it I do? What is it I do? Seems to me that's a very interesting drive in the arts.
And do you think her family was part of the effect of this?
Yeah.
You know, her upbringing in this sort of an intellectual environment.
Yeah. So her father, Benjamin Gompertz, she was born 1902, Lucie Gompertz. He was a prominent doctor, a Jewish family. We would say liberal, not overly separatist. They were out there in the environment. And she grew up, and her father and her mother very much attached to intellectual life in the city. So Lucie would be sitting there, perhaps, as a young lady, watching a kind of salon environment in her home, with leading intellectuals coming to chat with her parents and having dinner with them and so forth. So privileged. And we would say also her parents very interested in the arts, but her father's a doctor. So art and science being pulled together. Technology and art being pulled together. So she grew up in an environment where they didn't draw distinctions between art, science, technology, and so forth, which I think is going to be important for her. Yeah.
And her mother's family, also an intellectual family?
Absolutely. Her mother, Gisela, was from the Eisenstadt family, who were wealthy. Effectively a dynasty, really. And her grandmother used to take her around, travel around with her as a little girl. And we can imagine this very bright, stern older lady taking this little girl around and feeding her with ideas as they went. So from a very early age, she would have been absorbing culture in what was one of the most cultural cities in the world at that time.
Yeah.
Vienna.
And it's not just her mother and her grandmother and her father in introducing her to intellectual ideas. She also has this sort of beloved uncle, Shandor, who influences her with travels across Europe. He's a wealthy winemaker. He's a passionate collector of ceramics, and there's some accounting. I think that this is maybe where the beginnings of her love for ceramics start, because he has Roman pottery in his collection.
Yeah, he has a collection of sorts. And, it's a dream upbringing for someone who's going to live in the cultural world, of these enlightened, rather lovely relations taking her around. There is something bigger going on, though. The Austro-Hungarian Empire, which had dominated Europe, is coming, it's creeping to its close. And in general, I would say the city and Austria more broadly is beginning to feel economically and socially the pressures of imperial decline. So that when the First World War breaks out and Austria is bound up and tied up in all kinds of other conflicts in its own region, really we might see that it's the beginning of the end.
Right.
of
Right.
Vienna as a dominant European culture. I mean, it's still a magnificent city, of course, but we wouldn't think of it
Right,
as a
right.
driving
And
motor force in the avant-garde. So this moment is the last moment.
it is, but before war breaks out, she's educated at some of these really elite institutions. She's educated early on at a place called the Gymnasium, which sounds sort of like a terrifying name to me, but and it was apparently one of sort of the most demanding, austere secondary schools in Austria. But it offered a humanist approach to education. So she's impacted, as you say, by the changing sort of elements of society, this leading into World War I decline of this empire. And she would have been a teenager during World War I. So I think it's important to speak a little bit, think a little bit about what life would have been like for her, what impact the war would have had on her and her family as a teenager, as a young Jewish woman. As a part of a family of intellectuals. Can we sort of talk through some of those pieces that certainly I think have would impact her in her later years?
Yeah. I mean, it's an elite education she has at the gymnasium, and then goes on, with her parents' permission, to study at the Vienna art school, the Kunstgewerbeschule. And it's there where she starts to really bump into the leading figures of her day. Joseph Hoffmann is perhaps the single great giant, and we would see Hoffmann as one of the most important designers, as I suggested, in European art history, and certainly a major figure at that time. And it would be wise to always keep Hoffmann in the back of our minds when we look at Lucie's work right through her life, I would say. He was a major figure, a great exponent of the Gesamtkunstwerk as well, and driving architectural practice across Europe.
So before we really dive into her art education, I also just want to bring forward sort of the or make mention of sort of some of the acute trauma and hardships she would have faced as a Jewish family during World War I, right? Food shortages, growing sense of insecurity for Jews. And I think there's this sort of harrowing account of her brother enlisting sort of in the early days because he didn't want to be labeled as a Jewish coward. And he's killed within weeks, I think, of his enlistment. And there's she would later write that she was 15 years old at the time. She was leaving a party. And she hears the news and she swears she'll never indulge in pleasures again. So that, for me, there's, we talk a little bit about kind of the restraint within her work and the really sort of poignant design sense. And I also have to wonder if these early experiences also would impact the way that she approaches her making. Do you see a connection there?
Yeah, I think the death of her brother, we could argue, well, it was happening to millions of families, and it's the same for everyone. And but in Lucie's case, the death of her brother seemed to have had a profound effect that she didn't really come out of for the rest of her life. One wonders to what extent it affected her character and her outlook. By reputation, from many people one knows who knew her, tough lady, deep, difficult to get to know, and so forth. So maybe a slight closing off occurs emotionally. It might have affected her work in that it has that profound objectivity to it, and she's no expressionist. And her ceramics are really an exercise in quite a pure abstraction, we would say. So the other thing, to create a backdrop, and we tend to think of Germany and Austria in the 30s leading up to the Second World War for the appalling treatment of the Jewish people. But it had been going on continually through European history, and stepped up in the later 19th century. And so even though she came from a wealthy, successful family, perhaps the writing was on the wall a little as we came through. And in the First World War, yes, very clearly, whilst many Jewish people lost their lives, young men lost their lives in the war fighting for Austria, nevertheless, there was a strange stigma against the Jewish populations, and that started to get more intense.
Right. So the First World War comes to a close. She enrolls to study art at really the sister school of the Wiener Werkstatt.
Yeah.
And she's influenced by that connection. Do we think she always wanted to be a potter?
No, I think that she was splashing around a little bit.
Yeah.
And as you say, her lovely uncle had exposed her to ancient ceramic and a few other things. And she could see ceramic practice in Vienna as well.
Right. And I think she does end up enrolling in school with the intent to study sculpture, which I think is interesting.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I feel like it's a story we're going to continue to tell over and over again across the globe with 20th century artists, is that she had to take a ceramics class. And she writes that once she discovered the potter's wheel, she was lost to it, which I think is a lovely sentiment. Let's talk a little bit about what that training was like. She studied with a man named Michael Polanyi. So she's not at the Wiener Werkstatt, but she's at this sort of sister school, and she's just diving. She becomes lost to the wheel, and she dives in. And it turns out she's good, right?
So as I was suggesting, I get the sense with Lucie that she was looking for the thing.
Yeah. And this is the moment she finds the thing.
And she found the thing. And it happens quite a lot in the history of ceramic. First of all, because ceramic historically was often treated as a lowly trade, something you do as an apprentice and so on and so on. And we're just reaching the point where the great art schools of Europe are treating ceramic as a companion discipline to the other major arts. So she bumps into it because of that. And we would say that quite often, we'll find this as we go through, quite a lot of our major potters train in something else to start with, and then it fell into pottery.
But she's not really interested in this sort of folky, sort of traditional ceramics that are coming up and through at this point. She is looking for sort of a metropolitan, sophisticated look, and it's not at all rustic, right? So if we think about British ceramics at a similar time, we could think about our dear boy Bernard Leach and the sort of rustic style that's of everyday sort of pots. She's making work that is really intended to be art.
Yeah.
Yeah.
She struck lucky, I would say, in that in a number of European countries, not least France, America, we're getting a generation of ceramic people who are artists. They think they are artists. They are promoting. Adelaide Robineau, I think, is one of the great figures. We both had a woman promoting the idea that ceramic is an art. So she hits a moment where ceramic could be your practice as an artist. And in Vienna, that was very acceptable. We would say also the idea of Viennese sculpture, it ain't folky, to say the very least.
Right.
It's highly sophisticated.
Yeah. Refined.
And there is a sophistry to it all, which is the exact opposite of the vernacular.
And so these works that she's making, these early pieces, they're maybe deceptively simple, they're cylindrical, they're bowls. She is, I think she's beginning this lifelong search for sort of essential purity of form. And not just in the form, she really became a master of material. She developed really interesting glazes that one might not think of as sort of utilitarian in some ways, some sort of frothy, almost lava type glazes. volcanic sort of surfaces. Becomes one of her trademarks. And she would actually once fire these. So she would. So that really means that traditionally there are sort of two firings. Most people out there, who if they're dabbling in clay, you make your work, you dry it, you fire it in a bisque or a biscuit kiln. It becomes sort of a hard porous ceramic material, and then you apply glaze. But she's not doing that. She's making these paper thin bowls. We were looking at one of her pink sort of narrow-footed flared bowls yesterday in the V&A, and it feels a bit like an eggshell, but one of the incredible things that she does is that she had this incredible ability to merge the surface with the form. So it doesn't look like a glaze has been put on it. It's not that it's sort of been done to. They are completely combined, right? The surface becomes the form is the surface. It's not one or another, and there's such a deep complexity within those surfaces, I think.
And she so beautifully put.
She begins that here
Yeah.
In school. So I really see this connection to her original intentions of sculpture.
Yeah. I completely buy that. I think it's beautifully put. And quite often, there are all kinds of ceramic, but one of the greatest ceramic forms in any culture when they arrive there is that the relationship of the surface to the overall form of the pot is the key to its beauty. And what great ceramic gives you is a oneness, a wholeness. Yeah. And she picked that up pretty early on. And her teachers would have been promoting and pushing that as well. It's a feature across all of the arts that across furniture and architecture, that the surfaces and spaces relate, and you get a sense of oneness about it. And she got there pretty early.
Yeah. I mean, some of her work as a student was being shown in exhibitions and winning prizes. And so she has one of those, there are certain people who are good at things, right? I'm always mesmerized by students of mine who excel at math and think things like statistics are fun. My brain doesn't work that way. And then there are people who sit down at the potter's wheel for the first time and get it like, snap of your fingers, whereas others will sort of struggle and toil to really work the thing out. But she is the first. She's the former. She sits down. She gets this she has this intuition. I think a very quick learner. Not to say that she didn't work at it, because you can see there's evidence in these forms of practice.
Great thrower?
I think so. A brilliant thrower, I would say. So she finishes school and she sets up her life as a working artist in Vienna. And she, even though she's not working as as you mentioned, working as a part of the Gesamtkunstwerk, making in all sorts of disciplines, she does set up that environment in her home in Vienna.
Yeah. She created a Gesamtkunstwerk to live in. Absolutely. But also we should, the concept, she loved it. Her pots started popping up in other people's interiors, and she gets sucked into that wider environment whereby, if Hoffman were designing X, Y, or Z, whose tea set would he buy? Well, he'd buy Lucie Rie. And so she starts to, quite early on, find a good patronage. And again, we should then just look at the bigger picture. You have an intellectual environment still. Austria is beginning to swing to the right, well before the National Socialists, the Germans, moved in. There's an anti-Semitism growing, and we moved from a situation in which there was quite a big liberal patronage. It starts to shrink, and it starts to shrink through the 20s and 30s, without any doubt. But nevertheless, through the 20s, she's growing, she's doing well, she's making money.
She gets married.
She gets married in 1926 to Hans Rie.
Indeed.
And hence we have Lucie Rie. Now, there's all kinds of discussion around the nature of the marriage and so forth. one reads accounts whereby it was really his brother that she liked. I don't know if that's true or not. It wouldn't surprise me with Lucie, but she marries Hans Rie, and they get along. They do things together. They're especially interested in sports. So she's a pretty fit. She likes skiing and so forth. So the outdoor life. So the two have that in common, without any doubt.
But he's not really interested in the arts in the same kind of way.
We get the picture that he couldn't care less about all of that, and quite a traditional Austrian man. Nevertheless, they stay together for a period of time, but it's not destined to be a marriage that lasts. But it almost certainly gave her a measure of independence and support so that she could continue with her studio practice, because we all know that potters, you people make millions of pounds every year, don't you?
Yes, we're very wealthy.
You're drowning in it. Right, okay. So,
but remember, she came from money, though, and her uncle Sándor actually gives them an apartment. So she's able to set up her own studio at home. She doesn't have to cover the cost of housing, which, I think affords her a bit of freedom there and ability to sort of pursue the type of work she wants to make.
She wasn't starving in an attic.
No. And so her
she was well, but nevertheless, it would, and I agree with you, the family looked after her. But as with all children as they grow up, they like the idea of independence and cutting themselves loose. And she was a strong woman.
Yeah.
She had to be strong, actually.
Yeah, absolutely.
To get this far. And in a, somewhat mildly misogynist world. And I think Hans, that partnership allowed her to step to one side of the family in terms of support.
But so her practice is growing throughout the 20s and into the 30s.
Starts winning prizes.
She starts winning prizes. She wins a silver medal at the 1937 Paris International Expo. You mentioned her marriage doesn't end up lasting, and even though she's growing and building this notoriety, it's also the 1930s, and we know what happens sort of globally in the 1930s. But for her personally, she between the years of 1932 and 1937, she loses her grandmother, her mother, and her father. They all pass, and these are as we've talked about today, early foundational figures and who really set her up to become the person that we know her as. Yeah. She's gaining this recognition in Vienna, and she's becoming sort of pretty well known across Europe.
She's beginning to get there, yeah. We would say through the 30s, her reputation, certainly in Austria, thought of as one of the top end, completely known. And increasingly, in Germany too, she starts to build her reputation. So you mentioned the Paris World's Fair. 1937, the French stage their last great World's Fair. Their last great expo, and they invited all the countries of Europe to take part, including the Soviet Union and the National Socialists in Germany. And it was a massive attempt to promote discussion and peace and so forth. Ironically, of course, the Germans are going to be back in Paris a couple of years later in a very different way. But she was a featured person in the Austrian pavilion, and had a pretty handsome little section to herself, and she won a prize. Now, we've got to remember, this is the Expo that Picasso painted Guernica for, that Juan Miro, we tend to forget, did an enormous mural. All the great artists of Europe were there, and so on and so on and so on. And the brief was to embrace modernism and modernity. The British were completely on song. We built a pavilion that looked like a country pub. With a man in waders outside the front, a stuffed man, I might add, pretending he was fishing. So we really understood modernism at that stage. But this was perhaps the single most dramatic expo ever held, because all the warring powers in Europe
are there,
built their things. Yeah. And Lucie was there, and she won a prize. So, that gives a real sense of status. But of course, the National Socialists have been in power in 1933. they're on the very edge of, they're looking at Austria, and as we know, in due course, moved in. Now, we can, you know, there are many films showing the Austrian citizens waving the Nazis in and cheering, but clearly also there must have been a lot of terrified people in Austria, and the exodus out of Austria by the intellectual classes is considerable at that moment.
Right. And this, you know, of course, coincides with, you know, sort of the loss of this prosperity. You know, fascism, as you're mentioning, is on the rise. And so there is pressure rising on her because of backlash to Jews.
Right. So she goes from, by the way, she had 70 pots in the Paris Expo.
Yeah.
I mean, that would be a career climax for any artist, we would think. March 1938, the Germans move in. At that stage, it's very clear to the Jewish population that they're at risk, and the exodus begins. And on the whole, they're going to a number of places. It's America and Britain, quite heavily at that stage. The Bauhaus, the great liberal school in Germany, is shut by the National Socialists in 1933. So the writing is on the wall for 5 years before she makes her move.
And her dear uncle, I think, is arrested by the Gestapo. He's imprisoned. He's forced to surrender his art collection. This is a familiar refrain before he eventually flees to Palestine. And Lucie's career would come to an abrupt stop. She and her husband would end up ultimately fleeing Austria to London with the anecdote that she packed a few pots in her suitcase and they flee I think in 1939, 38, 39. And so they flee to London. And this is the point in which she has this major turning point, right? She's had to leave everything she's built behind. As you mentioned, she's had this defining career moment of these 70 pots at the Paris Expo. And she's making refined, sophisticated, elegant work. And she moves to London, and there's a completely different aesthetic, as you mentioned, to ceramics. But, you know, she has to set up an entirely new life in London.
Yeah. I mean, we can only dream about how tough this is to go from being effectively the top ceramic artist in your country. She had the biggest showing at the World's Fair, and well known and powerful. And she arrives in London. And again, we need to put our heads back into that time, in that whilst the art world is beginning to internationalize, everyone knew who Picasso was. Nevertheless, it's still a relatively nationally driven world in terms of patronage and survival. So when she got to London, nobody knew who she was.
And so it wasn't really a warm welcome.
No. And she's a woman. She has a German accent in the sense that she's Austrian at that moment. So, and she's Jewish. And whilst anti-Semitism was less of an issue in the UK, it's still a reality. It's a reality everywhere. So this woman arrives in a situation where she's got to start all over again. And we can only imagine how difficult that was and tough for her. But she picked herself up, and she, got herself going. She rented a former garage at Albion Mews, which is not far from Paddington Station, number 18. And she's quite a single-minded person, it seems to me, because she stayed there.
Yeah, her entire life.
She never moved. So, boom, she's there. And she stays with it, and she gets stuck in. Now, clearly, she comes from the German-speaking world. She also comes from an intellectual world, so she had some English, but she basically had to learn the language. And with all of our friends who were born in other countries that we have, and when you can learn English and take part in that, but actually what a joy to speak your own language and engage in your own culture from time to time. So she starts to look around, and make connections with the expatriate population. Now, clearly at that stage, we're on the edge of the major war. But it's reasonably fair to assume, and I think it broadly and loosely was, the Austrians and Germans who were already in the UK were ones who were escaping the regime. But nevertheless, they all came under scrutiny, and a significant number of them were interned and so forth. We'll come back to that when we get to Hans Koper. She had connections in one way or another, and so while she was scrutinized, she wasn't interned or taken away. But she was actually a lady potter. So,
right, but she was labeled an enemy alien. So I mean, life was incredibly difficult for her, I would have imagined. Her license was sort of revoked from the Board of Trade. She was not able to make pots initially. And she survives by being hired by a family friend, Fritz Lampel, who moved his glass-making company to the UK and started making glass buttons because they were not restricted as a part of these war rules, right? And so he hires her because she needs to make a living. She needs to be able to afford her apartment, which by all accounts is small, well designed. She actually has the interior of her Vienna flat dismantled, packed up, and sent and reassembled there. So she's reestablishing.
It's great, isn't it?
I know,
it's really
great. Fantastic.
Yeah.
She's trying, kind of, I think, creating a space where she feels really comfortable and perhaps safe in a larger climate where she was not at all safe.
Yeah. So she'd lost everything.
Yeah.
And she starts rebuilding. And yes, you're absolutely right that she built a network and did everything she could. And one thing is that the expatriate Austrians and Germans, they did try and look to each other and so forth. So a fascinating moment in her life, because again, her pots by this stage in 1937 in Paris, which was still by far out and away the center of the art world. So she triumphed there. A couple of years later, she's got nothing in London. And we're emphasizing that, but it's her character, which one is impressed by. She starts to make buttons.
Yeah.
Now, we shouldn't forget that what was rather in a derogatory way known as the rag trade, but the clothing industry, which was heavily based in the East End of London, was quite heavily Jewish. Actually, there's a long history of the clothing industry and the textile industry in the UK because it's frequently driven by emigres. In previous centuries have been the Huguenots, but quite powerful, quite a number of Jewish companies and so forth. So, and clearly that connection helped. And she starts to design buttons, and there are huge numbers of buttons come out. An incredibly hard worker.
And she starts with these glass buttons, but she ultimately starts making them out of stoneware.
Yeah.
In her own studio. And this is how she makes her money, right?
Yeah.
And designing these buttons for the fashion industry.
Yeah.
And it becomes quite a little industry in her studio.
They're beautiful things, and I'm very lucky to have played with quite a lot of them. At the V&A and at the Sainsbury's Centre. Sainsbury's Centre has hundreds of them, and they're all out there designed in a rather lovely flourish. All unique, all beautiful, exquisite little things, and it kind of takes off.
So she's not just making these by herself.
She gets a little team around her.
Yeah.
Yeah. So very important there to remind ourselves that this is rather different from the pottery world she's going to discover in Britain. Which came from the arts and crafts movement, the hand-making pottery, and we're going to look at that in many future episodes. But this is a design ethic. This is about high, sophisticated design, isn't it? So Lucie has no problem designing the things and getting them made by her team. But it must have been terrifying to be in her team, I would think, because, a taskmaster
Yeah.
because these things are all exquisite, and you would never think, looking at them, that she had made every single one. But she had a little team. And that kept her going and it kept her alive. And at that time also, Albion Mews became a bit of a kind of salon place of visiting intellectuals and writers and so forth. And she started to settle. And at that stage, she starts to get her own work going again properly, and she starts to meet people. And there are some incredibly interesting meetings that take place. Perhaps the single most important one is with the master potter and the king of British ceramics at the time, Bernard Leach.
Yeah.
She meets Bernard and they have an interaction. When they first got to know each other, Leach was completely puzzled by her work.
Mm-hmm.
It didn't do what he thought ceramics did. We don't really know what she thought of his work, but let's just assume she didn't like it much. But Leach, by that point in time, had connected his approach to ceramics to a pretty deep moral outlook on the world, really following on from the arts and crafts movement and William Morris. And again, we'll come back to this in future because it's so interesting. Yeah. But one of the elements of Leach is that it's a lifestyle.
Right. And it's important just to, also note that he is really the father of the British studio pottery movement. Yeah. It's rooted in this sort of Anglo-Japanese idea of aesthetics and arts and crafts morality. And it's quite differing perspectives, right? It's not this refined design aesthetic modernism that Lucie has been surrounded with and by. And so, I would imagine she might have felt a bit like a fish out of water. Maybe she didn't fully understand the kind of things that he was setting up, and he didn't quite understand the type of work that she was making. But to your accounts of these letters that you found, it seems that they do have a friendship over the years.
We'll come back to their relationship later, but just to sum it up, it really is exactly as you say, Stephanie, that the British ethos in studio ceramics come from a completely different route. And if we took it back to 1900 and looked around, the British hated European Art Nouveau. They didn't like the secession, and they walked away from it. And in fact, London was not a centre for that kind of practice.
And most potters are moving to the countryside and setting up a studio in this sort of idyllic landscape. She's setting up a Gesamtkunstwerk designed small apartment and studio in the middle of London, right? So they're kind of polar opposites. Yeah. And you mentioned that people come from sort of all over this immigrant group of folks across London, and there are sort of lots of self-help organizations for refugees of how do you sort of get back on your feet, and through this, Lucie sort of helps. She hires for the button making a lot of these refugees, and through a gallery owner that she knew named William Oley, she learned of a young German refugee who desperately needed work. Paul, who was this man?
His name was Hans Koper. He was a young man who'd had a desperate previous decade in order to end up in London, lonely, trying to survive, and bangs on the door of Albion Mews. And she opens it, and that's their very first meeting, the two of them, and Lucie Rie takes in Hans Koper.
And she would later account that he was extraordinarily good looking, but he was starved. He was really poverty stricken. And she took him in and employed him to make buttons for £3 and 10 shillings a week. And he had never touched clay before, but he would have a facility with this material. So I think that's a great place for us to pause today. From
Hans Koper, the button maker.
Hans Koper, the button maker, starting from the intellectual heights of sort of the Vienna Werkstatt to fleeing the Gestapo and making ceramic buttons in her London garage. Lucie Rie, I think we can see her resilience and perhaps her unyielding commitment to beauty, I think. And it sets a stage for us for one of the most important partnerships, I think, in the history of 20th century art history.
I would say it's one of the most important relationships in the history of ceramics, period.
Yeah. I hope that everyone will join us next week for part 2 of this story, where we're gonna uncover this harrowing, tragic survival story of Hans Koper and what led him from Germany to London and eventually to knock on that door of Lucie Rie's studio. And we'll have a chance to have a discussion about the powerful legacy that both of these artists have left on the world. So I think that that's it for us this week. Thanks so much for listening. Goodbye.
Goodbye.
So if you want to see more of their incredible work, check out the exhibition Lucie Rie, Hans Koper, Life at the Wheel, which will be on view at the Offer Waterman Gallery in London, middle of September to the end of October.